So you've had your Steam Deck for quite some time now. You've played Aperture Death's Job and the rest of your Steam library. And so far, it's been a great experience. But if you fancy yourself as an advanced user, here are some valuable advanced tips for you. Do keep in mind that these tips were made more for the advanced user than the average user. As such, there may be some difficulties. That's your one disclaimer. The first tip you should consider is getting Proton GE. Proton GE is an alternative form of Proton managed by Glorious Eggroll himself. The main difference is that Proton GE implements features that simply put cannot be featured in regular old Proton. You know, due to legal reasons. Some games that don't work under Proton may work in Proton GE instead, though it's not a silver bullet. Some games do work better under regular Proton, so you shouldn't just use Proton GE for every game on your library. Installing Proton GE is pretty simple. Go to the Discover App Store and download Proton UpQT. This is a utility meant to help you add Proton GE to your Steam instance. Ideally, you'd want to select the latest version of Proton GE every time, unless an older version of Proton GE works better for you for a specific game. The next button you should know about is the Quick Access menu button. If you remember in my last video, I mentioned that holding the Steam button gives you access to all of these shortcuts. For example, holding Steam and pressing X pulls up the keyboard, but you can also execute these shortcuts with the Quick Access menu button instead. The Quick Access menu button being the ellipsis button. This would be more useful for shortcuts like brightness up and down. The next tip is to definitely look into getting your non-Steam titles working on Steam Deck. And in this case, I definitely don't mean emulation. I mean your GOG titles, your Epic Games titles, your titles from other storefronts, maybe your freeware titles. For your GOG and Epic Games libraries, I recommend getting Heroic Games Launcher. It's a very polished third-party Epic and GOG launcher. I've already made a few videos about this launcher, so I would recommend checking those videos out. However, outside of GOG and Epic Games, I would recommend getting Lutris for everything else. I've also made a video about that as well, so be sure to check it out. This next tip is more for your non-Steam titles as well. DXVK Asynchronous Shader Compilation. What's that for? Well, it's simple really. Typically when you play a non-Steam title, you tend to encounter stutters, especially if you encounter new special effects. And typically the cause of these stutters is the fact that your Steam Deck is compiling the shaders. It only freezes for like a nanosecond, but it's enough to throw you off. By enabling the DXVK async option, you're essentially telling DXVK to render that frame even if the shader cache isn't there. Oh, it'll still cache that shader, but it won't cache that shader right then and there. It can pose an issue for some games though, especially for multiplayer games, which is why you should only really do this on single player titles, unless otherwise stated. The easiest way to get this set up is to use Proton GE, as Proton GE has asynchronization built in. And from there you type in this launch argument, dxvk_async equals 1, $command %. This is for people that add non-Steam games directly to Steam as its own shortcut. You probably shouldn't do this with most Steam games anyways. Now, what if you manage your Steam games outside of Steam? Like let's say for example, you use Lutris. You can actually install something called WineGE into Lutris, which is just like Proton GE, but it's meant for non-Steam titles. So yeah, there's that. Set your game's Wine version to Lutris GE, and then go to System Options, and then add the variable, same as before. DXVK async equals 1. Press save and you should be good. It's time for you to master dual trackpad typing. Dual trackpad typing is a very simple concept. See, when you pull the keyboard up, instead of using the D-pad and the A button to select one letter at a time, instead you should use both trackpads to type. Left trackpad for the left side of the keyboard and right trackpad for the right side of the keyboard. It seems like a no-brainer, but I see a lot of people just completely disregarding dual trackpad typing. And believe me, it'll change your life for the better. You ever see those tutorials on YouTube that have you type out a bunch of commands? You could feasibly use your on-screen keyboard to do a bunch of these tutorials, but using a physical keyboard is always going to be faster. You could dock your Steam Deck and plug a keyboard into it, or use a Bluetooth keyboard, but I believe there's a much easier alternative. Steam Remote Play. Its main purpose is pretty obvious: remote access into your gaming desktop. This also includes the Steam Deck, meaning you can go into your Steam Deck in desktop mode. Turn on Steam Link, connect to your Steam Deck, and control it via mouse and keyboard. Another bonus is that you can use this to record footage off of your Steam Deck. Well, you know, provided you have good enough internet. This next tip is gonna blow your mind. You can download something called Steam Tinker Launch. Steam Tinker Launch is probably the closest thing to a true Swiss Army knife when it comes to Steam games. There's a ton of functionality baked into Steam Tinker Launch. The most notable functions though are obviously Vortex mod support, Mod Organizer 2 support, and Reshade. I've got a prior video on Steam Tinker Launch if you want to watch that, though in the future though I may make a revised video on Steam Tinker Launch to see what's changed and to see if anything else can be done now. So before we move on to our top 3 facts, let's bring up some honorable mentions. Cryo Tools is a utility you can use to enhance your Steam Deck performance for certain games. I'm gonna level with you, the only reason why this is an honorable mention is because I haven't really tested it out myself. I do want to make a dedicated video about Cryo Tools later on, but until then, you'll just have to settle with this honorable mention. Sorry, Cryo guy. Next up are some fairly basic hardware modifications, namely swapping out your sticks for Hall effect sticks, as well as swapping out your SSD and even your fan. I've also made a video about doing these exact 3 things. And of course, the final honorable mention goes to ProtonDB. It's an advanced Steam Deck tip to be sure, but it's more of a knowledge check than anything really. Once it gets sucked into ProtonDB, it becomes second nature. ProtonDB is an invaluable resource for not only telling you if games work properly on Linux, but also on your Steam Deck as well. And if games don't work as they should, but there are fixes for it, people will tell you how to fix them. Now on to our top 3. It's time for you to learn how to do power profiles. Battery life is a constant struggle when it comes to devices like this. We always want a game for as long as possible, but due to the fact that this is a portable device and it's not always connected to the wall, you're gonna run out of batteries at some point. How do we maximize this? Well, it's quite simple really. Power profiles. Inside the quick access menu is a power section. There's a plethora of options you can tweak to your heart's content. There's options to limit your frame rate by a factor of 2. This also depends on your refresh rate as well. There's options for half rate shading. There's also options to control your TDP as well as your GPU clock speeds. These 2 are probably going to be your main form of control. Let's take this game for example. This is Infernax. It's very much a homage to Zelda 2 and Castlevania. This isn't a very graphically demanding game, so you can take the clock speed all the way down to 200. However, when it comes to your TDP, you want to raise it a little above the minimum. That is 4 watts instead of 3 watts to get that stable 60 FPS. It's also thanks to this that I managed to increase my battery life up to an hour. That's right, an extra hour just by tweaking my TDP and GPU clocks. Okay, I'll admit that was a pretty simple example given that it's a 2D pixel art game. Now how about a graphically demanding game? Like, I don't know, Cyberpunk 2077. You have access to all of those settings including your PC settings. However, there's one thing that I didn't really discuss all that much. Putting your Steam Deck in 40Hz mode. Instead of having your screen run at 60Hz, instead you can have your screen run at 40Hz. 40Hz mode has some pretty extreme battery savings, and it still looks very smooth, way smoother than 30 FPS, and the input latency is still way better than 30 FPS. There's an excellent video about 40Hz mode on the Steam Deck by the Deckverse. All of his videos are really good. Tell him I said hi. This next tip right here is going to go in an interesting direction. Source ports of commercial titles that were never really meant to be open source. I see a lot of hype surrounding the Mario 64 PC port as well as the Zelda Ocarina of Time PC ports. And to be fair, both of those are excellent examples of this type of work. But as you may have guessed, there's more than just these 2. There are plenty of developers out there trying to clean room reverse engineer their favorite titles. Much of it is documentation purposes, but given that the entire game was re-implemented in an open source fashion, this opens up the doors for unofficial ports of games. Aside from your Super Mario 64 and Zelda ports, there's ports for Doom, Morrowind, Diablo 1, there's even in progress work for Jak and Daxter 1 as well, and the list goes on. And this right here is not the most advanced tip, but it's probably one of the most useful tips for the advanced user. Decky. What is Decky exactly? Decky is a plugin framework. Plugins made to enhance the game mode experience. The entire Steam interface is based on Chromium, which gives you a lot of leeway for modifying the interface if so desired. Decky has grown substantially since I last talked about it. There's a ton of updates for each of the plugins, as well as brand new plugins I've never seen before. Admittedly, I had to stop using Decky a while back because Decky became too unstable for me to use. But it seems like there's plenty of reports that Decky is stable again, so it might be time to give Decky another look. There are so many useful Decky plugins that they could have constituted this entire video. And so, as such, I may make a separate video about Decky later. If you like high-tech lowlife, you should check out the rest of my channel. And if you like the rest of my channel, you should like, subscribe, and spread the good gospel of high-tech lowlife. Furthermore, we have a community Discord server. There's a link in the description down below. Check us out.